Michael Timms received his Bachelor of Arts in English Writing from George Mason University and a doctorate in the chemical ecology of medicinal plants from the University of Maryland. His professional career includes working in the herbal supplement industry as managing partner of Cash Grocer Natural Foods, as a clinical herbalist in Alexandria, Virginia, and as an academic researcher. Dr. Timms collaborated with federal regulators providing medicinal plant toxicity assessment, co-developed HerbMed, a web-based herbal database providing access to the scientific data on the use and safety of herbal medicine, and completed an NIH-NIST postdoctoral fellowship developing botanical standard reference materials. Dr. Timms has also created Bardo's Calculus, a science education blog, and the Hyattstown Millstone, an artist and poets blogging collective.
So my work was really focused on environmental biology. I taught Principles 108 and Micro, but this seemed the class that was most suited to the type of application. So in some ways, as a biologist, this issue of race, once you get past the need for vitamin D, thiamine, the single base pair mutation that led to alteration in pigmentation, and some of those selective pressures, it really, for me, came down to I'm more interested in having the kids begin to look at complexity, begin to see themselves in the complexity of the natural world, and with that, have the issues of race drop away. So I had a very indirect approach. And if you look up here, the question is, how are they alike? How are they different? Are there two races up there? Or two species, maybe? Turns out, two species. That last one is Neanderthal. But all three of them carry a cluster of genes. Gene for freckles, red hair, and hazel to blue eyes. These tend to be inherited in clusters, and they don't follow the lines of race, because race as a biological phenomenon does not exist. So once that was there, I really moved toward a more complex interaction with environments. So the principles I worked from, for most of you, you're going to know these. Evolution. Nothing makes sense about biology and life without accounting for it. Emergence phenomena. This idea of biological systems being incredible problem solvers, the most amazing problem solvers that we have. And that this idea of pigmentation and this range of coloration is really an emergence phenomena based on interactions, pressures, complexities. Structure function. Life is what it does. What's it doing? Thermal regulation. Not just hearing, but thermal regulation. And then sustainability in this environmental class. That without diversity, without complexity, there isn't sustainability. And this can be looked at from the point of view of the people, but more importantly, the people as a larger environmental entity. So I got away from talking about the particularities of my assignments. And for this talk, I really want to focus on what it is that I sort of culled out. What was I actually doing underneath all these assignments? Because the assignments are going to be adjusted over time. There'll be iterative processes that change it. But the core elements that seemed to emerge out of this was I was creating new pedagogy because I wanted to engage the students. And I wanted them to get into this idea of ecologies being these incredibly emerging, complex entities. That I wanted them to begin to learn about environmental decision making, because it is a major topic of our time. How do decisions get made? What kind of time frame? I wanted them to encounter wonder, because part of what will happen in this environmental class is to tell them all the things that are wrong and what has to be fixed. If they don't experience wonder, what is it that will push them toward being decision makers that can make a difference? It's got to come from the heart. It's got to be based on data, but it's somewhere in there, it's got to come from the heart. And so that's really what I was trying to do through this, was to encourage this use of good data, of science, but this idea of seeing themselves in the face of nature. So how do you engage them? Some of the things I did that I carried away from this experience was visual learning, going to these museums, which is so object-oriented, and learning how to deconstruct objects, how to analyze objects, was really a revelation in terms of how I can teach. And so some of the things I did, I continued Amanda Truitt's, Amanda over in the corner, her YouTube project from the 2010 cohort. I added a few wrinkles to it, but I really liked the idea that they were having to deal with something on a visual basis. I added to this something that I'd been working on over time, which is they designed a permaculture garden. Permaculture being really another word for indigenous knowledge on how to create complex ecosystems that produce food and benefits to humans as well as the whole ecosystem. We did a walkabout in Sligo Creek. We used herbarium data from the Smithsonian's Botanical Division. We mapped it with Google Fusion. We went to those places in Sligo Creek and tried to identify the plants, some of which were collected 100 years ago. And we went to the Human Origins exhibit, which was truly fascinating for them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing is I wanted to localize the commons. The commons is a central theme to any environmental science, that we're all users, and how much control can we have over other users? If it's ethereal and theoretical, it just stays that way. So I tried to localize it by looking at Anacostia River and the watershed around it, and Sligo Creek. And that include looking at some of the human interaction. Anacostia River has an incredibly long history of initially being a fecund economic resource, then being a source of wastewater from town, and then an industrial dump. And then eventually free slave began to own property on it. And you begin to see this long change in the environment that's closely linked with social justice. That really came to the forefront when we looked at the history of it. Can the environment, either Anacostia or Sligo Creek, sustain current economic demand for resources? And going down to Sligo Creek, right off of the Tacoma Park campus, you could see where some of the sewer lines were coming down and they were leaking. And the houses up on those hills are nice houses. This is not an inexpensive area. And what does it say where you have this public domain and someone else's blank is flowing into it, right? And so this was a good stimulus for a very diverse student body. Another one was really this continued focus on who's making the decisions. They're political decisions, and they're based on these 2 to 6 year cycles. There are corporate decisions, which are based on quarterly reports. There are the questions of who speaks for nature, and that is both a question of morality, but it's also legal. And that when did it come about that some group could speak for nature, speak for the environment? And then the question that really drove a lot of the course is, how far out are these decisions going? Can we actually begin to investigate how to make long-term environmental decisions? Because global climate change, whether you believe in it or not, any number of issues, these are not short-term decisions. These are long-term decisions we need to make. So I really did a lot of work at trying to stimulate this idea that they're going to become the next wave of long-term decision makers, if we have any at all. So I got them outside. That was really important. Here we are, biologists, and we're sitting around inside. So we did go to Sligo Creek. We got through this huge database of herbarium collections. They had to go in, pick out images, ways to recognize things, and we did a walkabout. And there weren't a lot of plants left in the particular area where we walked, but some were. And we went about having a medical botany degree and background in that, we pointed out all the medicinal plants. And kids were throwing rocks in the creek and wading and walking through the brush. And it stimulated that childlike play that nature often does. And that's what our class should do, in my judgment, on some level. We went to the National Museum of the American Indian. They have a series of gardens. There are different ecosystems. There's a meadow ecosystem, there's a forest ecosystem, there's a wetlands, and there's a croplands. And we learned about the three sisters. This is one of the old permaculture concepts of how to combine complex plantings rather than monocrops. They have cisterns there for collecting waters. Looking at the different ecosystems, the different plants. It's really a great way for them to actually get out and see something. And we went to the zoo. Some of these kids had not been to the zoo since they were in elementary school. And we looked at the IUCN red list of animals and plants that are potentially extinct, asked them to go to the zoo, take one animal from each, and then question what drove their presence there. Turns out a lot of it is habitat loss. Is the zoo doing good? Is this just entertainment? Or is there a process, a biological process, a ecological process, a humane process that the zoo provides? And there weren't always clear-cut answers to that. And then this whole idea of long-term decision-making. Well, we asked them to make sense of graphical data. That's part of it. As a science, you have to make decisions based on data. So we looked at Sligo Creek, and we looked at some of the Friends of Sligo Creek data that came about, and you could see the linkage from upper Sligo Creek and the quality of invertebrate life, water quality, and then the lower parts of Sligo Creek. And there were vast differences. Some of these were construct blockages where you don't get the same flow. Some of it was the density of development around it. Some of it was based on a neighborhood that really was economically deprived, and it wasn't a high priority for the creek to be in great shape. So it was a way of exploring data about the health of a slice of an ecosystem that they were going to run into. We looked at a lot of climate change data. I had a experience with the Climate Change Fellowship with Dickinson, where I was developing this in conjunction. And the thing about climate change data is for them to understand where it comes from. A lot of it is proxy data. We don't have the timeline on current instrumentation to really make large claims. So we have to go back into ice, tree rings, we need to go back into sediment, look at old lakes, look at the layers of rock, any number of things to collect data and then look for trends. And it's not always clear, absolutely clear, that the cycle we're in is a human byproduct. I was up front with them and I said, my judgment as a scientist is global warming is occurring, but not everyone agrees. And I fed them conflicting streams of data that they had to figure out how they were going to coalesce and make a decision about. And it's very uncomfortable, but part of what I stress in class is get used to it. If you're not uncomfortable, you're not learning. If you're comfortable, then you're sitting around playing video games. We also did that work with both plant and animal diversity, which is also data that is sometimes conflicting. Was it human presence? Was it loss of habitat? Was it hunting? And some of it we don't know. What did we pull out of the ecosystem that allowed a lot of this collapse to occur? So I'm okay showing them as scientists we're ignorant. I'm okay with that because I'm proud of my ignorance. It's what drives me. So the idea, if I'm going to ask them to make decisions environmentally over the long term, I gave them some scenarios. One was Kevalina, Alaska. If you're not familiar with that, it's an area where there are some indigenous tribes, and the climate change that's occurring is amplified up there. Part of it has to do with the fact that normal freezing cycles, which go well into the late spring, aren't happening. And so you're getting large influxes of wave power that is destroying land, knocking it away. Their winter frozen supplies. They basically dig these huge pits and they put their food into it like an outdoor freezer. They're melting earlier in the year. Because of the erosion that's occurring much earlier, their water supplies from rivers are being contaminated. And these groups are suing BP and Exxon for millions of dollars in order to move them to a like environment. And this is an ethically challenging question about, is this the right decision? Do we let some people go, and who gets to decide that they get let go because of climate change? Another issue was the whole question of whether the National Zoo actually is promulgating diversity or not. And then this permaculture project, which we actually have space made available to us, and Amanda and I are both working on trying to make this happen on the Tacoma Park campus, where we're going to build a garden. We actually had a lab based on it. The plants didn't come through. I guess I should have ordered it myself, so we didn't get to put in the first part of it. But we're going to get them out in the soil, digging, putting in plants, building a complex system that's not all lined up and perfect, and begin to investigate uses of sort of multifunction, a plant that produces berries for birds, that also produces large leaves that fall as mulch, that also break open soil in order to aerate the soil, that looking at multifunction components of plants and animals in an ecosystem and how you can build diversity. So if you're familiar with that walkway that goes across to the health services, right underneath that is where a planned garden is going to slowly emerge. Knock on wood. So part of the question was, how do we extend that? If we're going to build this, how do we extend the benefits of something like that beyond campus? So they had to describe what this was going to do for campus, but what is it going to do beyond campus? Is this going to be a food garden for homeless? Is this going to be a pilot project for elementary schools? Some folks were designing gardens with hemp, not the hemp that you're thinking of. This is the indica sativa, and this is the one that produces the wonderful rope and great oils. And so they were coming up with lots of interesting ideas of how to take this and be of service. And so in trying to, they're so used to the decision, I'm so used to the decision-making processes that we read about every day. I wanted to bring in some different ideas for all of us to learn, and it was a learning process for me as well. So Gabriel Tyak, whose family is the chief family in the Piscataway Indian Nation, she's also a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian. She lives in Tacoma Park. She came and she gave us a talk on the historical environmental stewardship that her own tribe practices. And it was interesting to have the students investigate that, because some of it is based on population. It's easier to make these kind of decisions in smaller sizes. What role did cultural homogeneity play into this really good way of making decisions? But it also showed that values, whatever values you hold, really have an important sway on the type of decisions you make. The Zapotec Indian Nation in northern Yucatan area, they have large forested areas. As an example, they've been able to maintain and grow their forests while taking economic benefit out of it. And they built into this actual harvesting of trees, furniture making, pulp making. What they're doing, in essence, was the challenge I laid down from very early, the Iroquois nation of making decisions 7 generations ahead. That they were making decisions that were going to impact their grandkids and their grandkids' grandkids, and that they were growing something, they were protecting something. The Wildlands Project, this is something that's going on here in the US, and this is both a research project and it's a social project, which is how much wildlands do you need and what type of linkage do you need between them in developed areas to actually mimic a complex ecosystem that will support complex life forms. Not only the diversity of plants and animals, but the predators, the ones that we're always afraid of that are going to steal our poodles and our small children, right? So this is going on now. This is being investigated. And Detroit, for all that's going on that is bad, has got this wonderful renaissance of an agricultural product. swatches of land that are just emptied. Now they're beginning to develop gardens. So this is another model for them to look at, because their ecology is an urban ecology. And that has to be part of this course on the Tacoma Park campus, because that's what they identify with. They're urban, they're not agricultural, they're not going to be out, most of them aren't growing up on a farm. So the last part is this idea of wonder.
Right. Right, let's get to that island then.
I can see an animal.
Where?
I see three. I can see something flying low. I reckon it's like a coot or something. And two swans. Look up!
Oh, wow.
Yes, they're over there. Oh, and look at those amazing shapes.
Those are starlings, and it's unclear, and they're not sure what's going on. It wasn't a sudden explosion of bugs. They weren't hunting. Was that play? Was that a form of art? We think we're the only ones that can create art. Was that a group of animals, vertebrates, creating beauty? Who knows? But it's just amazing. It's something that can take your breath away. And that's part of teaching environmental biology. It's got to be. Any part of biology has got to have moments in it where they just say, that is frickin' cool. You know? If I don't get one of those a semester, then I have failed. So that's just how we roll. This is the thing, is teaching them to think like an environment, to think like they're an ecology, which is improvise. And I do that beginning of every class. I ask them to improvise about what we're going to be exposed to. It's not right or wrong. It's, can you discover what you know? Can you discover what you don't know? There's no discomfort, only adaptation. You don't see the environment complaining about how cold it is. Don't tell me that you got your homework late, just adapt. And life asks questions. Anything that's living, its very presence, what it does, how it adapts, how it evolves, is just a series of questions. It's asking, it's probing. And then finally, collaboration, turns out, as we study more and more, is so much more powerful than competition. There's so much more collaboration going on in the world on a natural system than competition. We used to think it was dog eat dog, cat eat dog, bird eat worm. Well, actually there's more symbiosis going on. So those are the lessons that we pick up from mimicking an environment. Thanks.